thank you all for joining us today for our last BEEP of the semester. So it's the Business Economic Environment Policy, or Business Environment and Economic Policy seminar series hosted by the Institute for Economic Inquiry. We host scholars across campus and across the United States to share interesting research that they're engaged in currently, and it's a great way for us to kind of collaborate and workshop some of this research that's happening right down the street or right down the hall sometimes. So today we are really fortunate to have Dr. Lydia Cooper present to us today. She is an associate professor in the English department at Creighton University. She focuses, her specializations is around Native American literature, Western and Southwestern literature, and gender studies. She has a book on Cormac McCarthy, which I imagine some of the topic today will be a derivative from that. So we're really looking forward to that. I'm thinking that there's going to be some economics into that, which we're really looking forward to. And she's extremely prolific, obviously, as an English professor. So that's kind of the name of the game. But we're really excited to have you here, and we're looking forward to your insights and your presentation today. So without any further ado, we'll let you take the stage. Thanks, Dr. Cooper.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I have to say I am a little nervous because I'll be talking today about particular works from Cormac McCarthy, but it does come from my larger book project. And in the general larger book project, what I'm talking about today is kind of a very small section. So in terms of my expertise, this is not my strongest area. So I'm really keen on getting any feedback, any thoughts from you. I would really appreciate that. So I'm looking forward to feedback. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. And at any point, it's weird to be giving a talk over Zoom. I'll be honest, I've not done this yet, like giving a talk. I've done other things over Zoom. Obviously, we live on Zoom now. But I wanted to say, as I'm talking, I am always happy to be stopped for questions that you might have. So I don't know what your preference would be, but I'm going to say just throw up a reaction of some sort, like thumbs up or something like that, and I'll take that as a hand raise, because I'm going to put you, let's see here, I'm going to give you my PowerPoint real quick. Assuming it works. There we go. Okay. And then that means that y'all are very tiny in the corner of my screen. So here we go. So just, I don't know, stop me any way that you can if you have any questions. All right, so the talk that I'm giving today is, I've called it Drugs, Diamonds, and Hitmen, mostly because that's fun. But I'm looking at a critique of capital through metaphor and narrative in Cormac McCarthy's The Counsellor. So I'll give a little bit of background for what I'm talking about, and then kind of dive into some sort of closer examination of the text that's drawn from my book, and then kind of pull back out and talk a little bit about some implications, and then open it up for questions. But again, at any point, feel free to interrupt, ask a question. I'm always happy to converse. Okay, so Cormac McCarthy, I'm not sure how familiar people are with Cormac McCarthy. I am very much a huge fan. So if you're into that sort of thing, he writes strange, weird literary books that are gorgeously written and have a lot of strange and disturbing things in them. So, you know, cannibalism, hitmen, that sort of thing. So delightful, good family-friendly reads. Kidding about that, but they're really fun. So McCarthy is a National Book Award and Pulitzer Prize-winning contemporary American novelist. He is widely acclaimed as one of our greatest living novelists. He's currently employed at the Santa Fe Institute as a scholar in residence there. It's a sort of term for people who have permanent recurring positions there. So the Santa Fe Institute is an institute that has devoted itself to the study of complex systems. And McCarthy is a novelist and a screenwriter. So he's a creative writer, but he collaborates with biologists, linguists, and evolutionary economists there. And his works, not surprisingly, are literary texts that show the influence of a lot of the things that he studies there. So you see a lot of representation of complexity applied to food webs, biosystems, economic structures, and lots of other things in basically everything that he writes. So my current book project from which this talk comes is currently titled Cormac McCarthy, A Complexity Theory of Literature. And in that book, I'm combining the fields of complexity studies and the humanities and using McCarthy's fiction as a case study, demonstrating our need to recognize interrelated complexities of economic policies, environmental crises, how literature intervenes in and shapes public discourse and personal value systems, cultural interactions, and that sort of thing. So to make its arguments, my book draws on archival materials related to McCarthy's research at the Institute, on other research published through the Institute. He does a lot of editing of different people's scholarship. So looking at some of his edits of their scholarship shows some of the interactions of his thoughts and theirs. And I do that in the context of looking at his literature, the stuff that he actually produces, in order to make my arguments. So before I kind of jump into what I'm specifically talking about today, I want to talk about some of my presumptions that are underlying my approach. And my sort of main premise here is that creative work, whether it's film, television, novels, music, whatever, can help us understand how powerful narrative and image is in shaping our perception of reality and our capacity to imagine, which is a critical tool in shaping or changing reality. You kind of have to imagine the way forward before you can take that step. So today I want to focus on one particular screenplay that McCarthy wrote. And jokingly, I say, but also I'm a little bit serious, it was made into one of the worst films of the last decade. It's just really bad. So it was directed by Ridley Scott and produced in 2013. A lot of the evidence that I'll be using for what I talk about comes from the screenplay. So I'm going to be citing from the screenplay. The film sticks pretty closely with the screenplay. Some of the scenes are shifted around a little bit, but in terms of actual content, they're very, very similar. I will be showing you some stills. I'm also happy to talk about why the film version of the screenplay was kind of a disaster. The screenplay itself is really interesting. The content is fascinating. McCarthy's a really philosophical writer, and the ideas in the screenplay are very interesting and I think worth talking about and looking at. And so I'm going to be doing that today. This is not, however, an endorsement of the film as like the greatest film. It's real weird and I think unsuccessful, and I'm happy to talk about why later on. Also, if you really liked it, then we can talk about that too. It has like all the hot actors in it, so it's visually fun, but just, it misses the mark a little bit. Anyway, in general, I suggest that the film probably flopped because it's a philosophical examination of late capitalism and its impacts on value systems and communities. And then it has a couple brutal shootout scenes and some attractive actors and not much acting in it. So it doesn't make for a really rich film experience, but I think that looking at the actual narrative and the actual arguments that are at play makes for a really interesting and, to my mind, fascinating case study for the role of literature, literary narratives, and defamiliarizing us from systems that surround us and imagining much needed alternatives. So basically, that's kind of my premise for what I'm talking about. So why do I study depictions of economic systems in literature? Okay, well, Mark Fisher co-opts the famous aphorism from Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And he calls this idea capitalist realism. Ellen Meiksson Woods in The Origin of Capitalism echoes Fisher's point and says that even in socialist accounts of the market, capitalism continues to be described as a function of innate human nature. So there's this idea that ways of imagining alternatives to capitalism can be very hard to come by. Literature might be one of those places. So that's kind of why I turn my attention to literature. Now, The Counsellor specifically is a deeply philosophical thriller whose larger project is bent on exposing this very problem, a sort of corporate failure to imagine alternatives to particular aspects of late capitalism in which particular moral failures are embedded. So this is the argument that The Counsellor is making. In The Counsellor, the illegal drug trade represents particular aspects of late capitalism during the decades that saw some of the most dramatic rates of acceleration in material production, consumption, the accretion of waste, reliance on fossil fuels, and wealth inequality. So this talk is going to look specifically at how The Counsellor describes failures of capitalism through metaphor and different narrative tropes that draw visual attention to a crucial missing narrative element, which is the moment of choice, in which the professional laborer adopts the tenets of the economic hegemon. So the absence of this moment of choice points to the most pernicious attribute of late capitalism, its claims of inevitability, that what we have is what we get and there isn't any other option. So in this particular instance, McCarthy is going to fundamentally disagree with Deirdre McCloskey. McCloskey says that choice, the right and ability to say no, defines capitalism and its benefits. The Counsellor is about the idea of choice in capitalism, its greatest virtue, as McCloskey would say, and McCarthy would argue here its greatest illusion. Okay, so this is The Counsellor. Why explore this topic in a film about the illegal drug trade across the US-Mexico border? Well, according to some scholars, the black market drug trade makes an unusually apt analogy for the form of late capitalism most dominant in the US in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So John Fitzgerald argues that illegal markets, rather than being an effect of transitional or emerging economies, may have a much more definitive role. They may be an irreducible aspect of legitimate market economies. So specifically, Fitzgerald argues that the illicit drug trade has been implicated in global capitalism since the rise of the opium trade in the 18th and 19th centuries. Control of the illicit drug market is really about regulation of rational decision-making through a combination of punishment, deterrence, and liberal market forces. So that is alternative licit pleasurable commodities incurring fewer costs, etc. So illegal markets function precisely the same as legal markets in terms of economic strategies and principles because they are a necessary component of the regulation of the licit market. Furthermore, in the shift towards late capitalism following the global oil boom created collapse of the 1970s, the global economy moved towards greater fluidity of labor and capital across national boundaries. And then with digital technologies around the turn of the 21st century, capital itself becomes increasingly displaced, located within neither spatial nor material boundaries. And illegal drug markets illustrate this process to an extreme degree as they turn the consumer into one aspect of the product itself. So they both create and control supply and demand. And the illegal drug trade dissolves the social into pure market relations, as Fitzgerald says. Okay, so The Counsellor tells a story in which the shadow economy built on addiction, the exploitation of suffering, and economic fragility is explicitly linked to its legal twin. This storyline suggests the interrelation of a shadow economy of transnational trade that capitalizes off of human bodies with the rampant deregulation of market capitalism in the US during the same time period. So it sort of reflects what Fitzgerald is arguing here. And it's not that surprising that McCarthy approaches these themes through the genre of a crime thriller. Rebecca Byron argues that the American Southwestern drug thriller genre, including both true crime and fictional accounts of cartel violence, exposes the internal logic of late capitalism. The system reduces the capitalist project to a simplified and horrifying version of itself, a consumer class whose entire function is to consume until death, and a production class that brutally eliminates competition and excess human labor to coalesce capital. Hitmen, Byron says, play a pivotal role in this system. Hitmen patrol the borders of the classes, reducing competition and eliminating consumer class members who fail in their function. Writing in this era of increased global wealth inequality, McCarthy zeroes in on the drug wars as a particularly potent example of the predatory practices of a deregulated market system that commodifies human bodies in terms of their market use value. specifically through the figures of a man who literally represents the law. So this is the eponymous Counsellor. So the film is called The Counsellor. He's given no name, he's just a lawyer. And through the cartel hitman, actually a hit woman played by Cameron Diaz, named Malkina, McCarthy suggests the pernicious implications of a market system in which labor and the human body are fungible. So here we get to The Counsellor. We'll talk about some of these images as we go. But in your, let's see, bottom left-hand side of the screen here, this is Malkina, the main baddie in the film. So, and if you enjoy Cameron Diaz, she really chews up the scenes in this film, so it's kind of worth it for her. But, you know, I guess viewer discretion advised. So The Counsellor is directed by Ridley Scott and is based on a script written by McCarthy, released in 2013 to really high expectations. And it largely failed those expectations. The film follows an unnamed lawyer just called Counsellor as he enters into an agreement with a cartel-affiliated nightclub owner, Reiner, and Reiner's dangerous, ambitious former call girl partner, Malkina. Reiner and the Counsellor plan a drug deal along with Reiner's associate, Westray. The Counsellor uses money from his exploits to buy an engagement ring for his Catholic, wholesome fiancée, Laura, played by Penelope Cruz. When the drug shipment is found and stolen by unknown parties, Westray warns the Counsellor that the cartel is going to hunt them down. And the Counsellor doesn't really pay attention to this because he thinks they're going to outsmart the cartel. Of course, they don't. And Laura gets kidnapped as punishment for the Counselor's failure to return the stolen goods. And then she's executed, and a snuff film of her brutal murder is given to the Counsellor as notice of her death. Meanwhile, Malkina has determined that it was Westray who made off with the funds from the drugs, so she hunts him down in London, assassinates him, decrypts his bank accounts, steals the money back, and kind of leaves the film triumphant. So the film did not perform well in the box office. It was a huge flop. But its failures as a thriller are not necessarily failures of its deeper symbolic arguments. Its failures are largely because it's a philosophical film operating under an illusion of a crime thriller. And again, kind of, this is my own personal gloss here, but I think Ridley Scott didn't quite get precisely what McCarthy was doing. And so he tries to frame it as a sort of glitzy, very visually exciting thriller without really paying attention to the fact that it's kind of meant to be a much slower moving film that's actually calling on the audience to think a little bit more clearly about what's going on. But it is what it is. So the film is populated by characters who are consumed by competition, aggression, and greed, and the film poses a series of vivid visual metaphors. And each of these metaphors represents distinct movements in the history of market capitalism, which is a system which famously finds competition, aggression, and greed good. So in one of the opening scenes of the film, the Counsellor visits a diamond merchant in Amsterdam. So he just kind of shows up in Amsterdam, and he's looking for a diamond for an engagement ring for his fiancée, Laura. The diamond merchant is just kind of chatting with the Counsellor about different things, and at one point, he just kind of says this phrase in Spanish, "En este mundo nada es perfecto." And then in response, the Counsellor says, "Ah, you are Sephardic," given no other explanation for that. So the Counsellor basically deduces that the diamond merchant is a Sephardic Jew based solely on a single Spanish phrase, and on the Counselor's assumption that a diamond merchant in Amsterdam would be Jewish. So that seems like a weird caricature. It's also a little anti-Semitic to just kind of show that right at the beginning of this film, and it's a little bit problematic, particularly in the context of the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and the United States. So what is going on here? Basically, what might seem like a bit of just racial stereotyping is actually playing the role of the first visual metaphor for the narrative's use of images that gesture towards aspects of the rise and evolution of capitalism in the West. And in this first scene, you kind of get this explicit call out of the history of Jews in the rise of Western capitalism and the diamond trade. So in 1913, German economist and sociologist Werner Sombart's Jews in Modern Capitalism famously made a case for the unique role of Jewish banking communities in laying the fiscal groundwork for capitalism in the 15th and 16th centuries. Zombart tracks Jewish economic practices, which include an interest in unlimited competition, speculation, market share bargaining, and international banking, to two unique aspects of Sephardic Jewish life in Western Europe in the late Middle Ages. So during that time, Jews were excluded from the commercial centers of European communities, forcing them to create their own practices and build their own capital. Second, they were expulsed from every European state throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. So they had to be really migratory. They also had to basically kind of keep capital separate from these major banking centers in Europe because they weren't allowed to own property, and they weren't allowed to engage with Christians in the same way. But that kind of protected them from some of the market shocks that hit in the 15th and 16th century in the European states. So Zombart makes this argument, and he basically summarizes his argument by saying the rise to economic importance of the European countries and towns whither the Sephardic Jews fled must be dated to the first appearance of the Spanish Jews in these places. So Zombart goes on after that and writes works praising the rising National Socialist Party of 1930s Germany, which is problematic. And because of that, he's kind of fallen out of style, but he's not actually entirely wrong. It is a commonplace now that Jewish communities lent money at interest while anti-usury laws for Christians were more or less consistent across Western Europe, because they tended to deal with liquid wealth rather than property because they weren't allowed to own land, and because of the tight bonds of the Jewish community, even in dispersion, Jewish lenders were able to offer competitive rates and be less affected by local shocks to markets. So the first scene in The Counsellor thematically conjures this problematic history of racial violence with the birth of capitalism, transnational capitalism specifically. So in this opening scene, the Jewish diamond merchant explains why when he offers the film's moral. So the merchant is watching the counselor look at these different diamonds, and he says that the diamond as an object is valuable because it is rare and it represents the nature of value itself. In a capitalist market system, financial value is based on accumulation, surplus, and dispossession, coalescence of surplus. But the merchant reminds the counselor that there are other value systems, such as non-materialistic religious and ethical paradigms that place enormous value on abstractions like love and life, rare because they are fragile and brief in a metaphysical rather than material sense. And he starts talking about Jesus as a witness to that which is valuable in a metaphysical rather than physical sense. And he sort of concludes this long monologue by saying, at our noblest, we announce to the darkness that we will not be diminished by the brevity of our lives. So he kind of has this pronouncement and then the scene just changes. So the counselor ignores him, buys his diamond, goes on his way. The scene cuts to the American Southwest, where the counselor's complicity in a drug dealing scheme is revealed in the next scene. So the shift from diamond merchants in Amsterdam to Mexican cartels and drug dealing in the US in the 21st century seems kind of abrupt. It is. But the narrative's thematic through line has been established in that previous scene. The history of global capitalism explicates market forces driving the illegal drug industry in the American Southwest, and we're going to see that explicated through some metaphors again. So when the scene changes to the counselor in the American Southwest, it goes to a jail scene, and the counselor is representing a man who was arrested for transporting drugs across the US-Mexico border. So then we get this whole scene. I'll describe that scene in a little bit. But in terms of its context, Dominic Corva argues that criminal justice practices in the US from the 1970s on illuminate the creation of a permanent American underclass, a criminal class. Corva describes the convergence of both Republican and Democratic penal policies, from Reagan's war on drugs to Clinton's tough on crime policies. And in this particular scene, the counselor performs a deed that initially seems like an act of mercy. He pays off a $400 ticket for that young man. And it kind of is explicated in the scene that he agrees to represent this young man and pay off his tickets because he's already representing the man's mother, who is in prison and whom the counselor represents. The young man's role in the narrative is primarily as a victim of criminal circumstance, but it's important to unpack what his story represents. So as the scene unfolds, you kind of get this backstory for why he was in prison. He was arrested for speeding, but he had a small amount of drugs, and he had $12,000 with him for his mother's bail bond. So the police seize the money, and that's why the young man is vulnerable to the counselor's scheme. So in other words, the young man's story presents a concise description of the fiscal processes by which the criminal justice system in the US creates a persistent criminal underclass, without which the entire system's financial infrastructure would collapse. So forfeiture provisions authorizing law enforcement agencies to seize drug-related assets, including any money over $10,000, have encouraged many budget-restricted agencies around the country to use the proceeds of arrests for budgetary needs. The economic stimulus given to law enforcement agencies by this provision ensures that the war on drugs has to continue in order for law enforcement agencies to continue to operate. The counselor actually explains this process, just in case the audience misses this. He's chatting with Westray about their theme, and Westray explains the caper so that the audience can kind of figure out what's going on. So he describes they're going to pick up 625 kilos pure uncut that will be brought in a sewage truck across the Mexican border. Westray provides the financial breakdown of this scheme this way. He says the cocaine goes for about $50 an ounce in Colombia, and the street price in Dallas can be as high as $2,000. The counselor, reflecting on the venture's financial rewards, says, so you're saying if the drug wars stop, this will dry up, right? In other words, as long as the policing and penal systems profit off the illegality of the product drives up the profitability of trafficking in that product's sale. So finally, the counselor underscores the humanitarian crisis at the heart of policies driven by an economic system aimed at the accumulation of surplus capital by looking at laborers reduced to human capital. The most explicit image of dehumanization in the pursuit of material gain is the murder weapon that Malkina uses. So she uses a bolito, which is, to the best of my knowledge, a murder device that McCarthy made up. I can't find evidence of it anywhere, and he likes to make up murder devices, so that's kind of consistent. A bolito is a mechanical device that forms a noose, which when you drop it over your victim's head, tightens automatically. And Malkina describes it as it tightens until it goes to zero. So it just kind of tightens around the neck and beheads the victim. Malkina is a violent, angry former call girl who betrays and murders both Reiner and Westray. At one point, she answers another character's question about where she comes from by claiming soy pura porteña. So she's possibly from Buenos Aires, maybe simply identifying herself as someone always on the move. She represents the disruptive South. She's an immigrant from South America who operates through disruptive technologies that liberate capital from banking centers of the Northern Hemisphere. So she hacks into Westray's accounts at the end of the film. But rather than sort of representing the disruption of the system, the rise of the global South, she represents the system replicating itself in emerging economies. Malkina, like the counselor, fails to imagine a value system apart from one based on surplus capital from the accumulation of wealth, even at the expense of others. In the screenplay's closing scene, she hires an escort, which is fairly ironic given that she got her start as a call girl. And in their conversation, she completes the metaphoric arc of the film by saying that she plans to translate the non-material digital wealth that she stole from Westray's accounts into diamonds. And she says that she wants to do that because, quote, the easiest way to compress wealth is diamonds, since diamonds weigh nothing at all. On the one hand, her claim is obviously untrue, since the original form of her wealth was digital, which literally weighs nothing at all. But diamonds are pure carbon super compressed. And hearkening back to that first scene, they're representing a history of exploitation of humans in the name of capital growth. So in the full extension of the metaphor, the only form of wealth purer than digital wealth is compressed carbon. And we start getting this imagery of the diamond as representing a single human life. So Malkina tells, there we go. There we go. So Malkina tells the escort that the one thing she wants more than anything in the world is to possess her own life. He asks her if you could buy anything, what would you buy with your new untold wealth? And she says, I imagine that I would like my innocence back, but I would never pay the price which it now commands on the market. So the escort that she's talking to is a man whose body has been ceded to her as a commodity, and he just nods and says, your own life. So here at the drama's conclusion, McCarthy tips his hand. If the good is a sort of internal freedom, the possession of one's own life, a state of autonomy McCloskey defines as the right and power to say no, then that good has been stripped away from individuals and societies. through a particularly pernicious form of consumer-driven global capitalism. Greed and consumption become its virtues, and once an individual has become complicit in the global exchange, it no longer matters whether they're part of a system or a disruptor. They can't say no to the system. So at the end of the film, Malkina kind of ends up on top. If there's a winner in the film, it's her. But we have this scene where she basically admits to someone who's more powerless than she is that she can't afford the price of her own life. She can't afford her innocence. As is typical of McCarthy's work, however, there is a subtle clue to alternatives to this failure of imagination. In a scene near the end, the counselor calls the cartel jefe to bargain for Laura's life. And the jefe reminds the counselor and the audience, by extension, that a choice was made at some point. So by the time the film starts, the counselor's already buying this expensive diamond. He's already got this plan in play. But the jefe tells him, you made a choice. And he says, he quotes some lines of poetry. The lines of poetry are from Antonio Machado's love poems, greeting. So these poems are basically a series of poems that Machado wrote to his wife to grieve her death after she dies. And the jefe cites these poems and then says that the poems teach us that, quote, there is no rule of exchange in the practice of love or the experience of loss. Grief transcends every value, the jefe says. A man would give whole nations to lift it from his heart, and yet with it you can buy nothing. So the jefe has seen through the absent choice in the film's plot to its underlying flaw. It is not actually a single moment or choice that condemned the counselor. It is rather his worldview, a philosophy in which all things, including human beings, are material goods in a cosmic exchange. So we kind of get this reference back to this beginning. In that first scene, he's literally attempting to put a diamond on his girlfriend to make her his fiance. And in that first scene, the diamond merchant kind of asks him, is she the type of woman who needs a diamond? And he says, no, she's not materialistic. But he claims that he loves her so much he wants to buy this big diamond. Of course, in order to afford it, he does this drug deal. She ends up dying because of it. So you kind of get this irony exposed here by the jefe, who basically tells him he didn't need to buy the diamond in the first place to prove his love. If he'd simply loved her without the diamond, without the drug deal, she would still be alive. So the counselor and Malkina both are already committed to the trajectories that are going to lead them on their sort of narrative paths by the time the film starts. The counselor loses the love of his life. Malkina loses her own self, her innocence. But when and why did they choose the path they're on? The film never says. The tragic failures that they both expose are their belief that their professional mastery will enable them to navigate the market economy's excesses without losing more than they can afford to lose. How and why they fail becomes this visual history of market capitalism spelled out through image and metaphor, gesturing towards failures of interpretation, of critical thought, and of ethical judgment. By removing characters' motivation, the film exposes the fragile artifice of its MacGuffin. The technical MacGuffin, of course, is the kilos of cocaine, which the audience only sees once towards the end of the film. They kind of show up in a sewage truck. But the cocaine could be anything. It could be diamonds, oil, drugs, Bitcoin, whatever. The ethical failures of late capitalism lie not in the system's easily corruptible nature, its literal banking on greed, but rather on society's persistent failures of imagination. Failures to imagine the extent of the human cost of certain growth-oriented economic practices, failures to imagine alternative ways to live together, and perhaps failures to value that which cannot be placed in any sort of material value. You can't put a diamond on love is basically the premise of the film, boiled down. So that's my talk. I would love to hear any questions that you have, comments, feedback.
Lydia, this is Taylor Keene. How are you today?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
This is the only work of McCarthy that I have not endeavored, and after your talk, I don't think I have to. just I'm shocked that he did something as cheesy as that. But I do absolutely love Blood Meridian.
Yeah.
And the character of the judge. Is there any comparisons with Blood Meridian at all with this work in terms of the perfect? If there was an Antichrist, it was the judge.
Yeah. Yeah, there actually, I think there's actually a lot of symbolic resonances between the two. Towards the end of Blood Meridian, so Blood Meridian kind of takes place for everyone else, starts in 1848. Well, technically 1833, but the main action starts in 1848 through 1878. And it's, you know, during, basically, it's about this unnamed kid who joins some scalp hunters and goes about trying to secure passage from Texas through California, and lots of violence and gunfights and that sort of thing. And there's this character called Judge Holden. And towards the end of the novel, the judge is this like absolutely bombastically evil character. And there's a bunch of other characters who are scalp hunters. So it's not like they're upstanding citizens. But they're all like, why is the judge so evil? What does he represent? And then towards the end, most of this party has been killed off. The kid is in prison, and the judge visits him in prison. And the kid is an arrow wound, and so he's kind of feverish, and he hallucinates this vision where he sees a cold forger making coins. And the cold forger is imprinting on the coins the image of the king, the face that represents the value of the species. And the kid has this moment, like he's trying to see the face on the coin to kind of say like, who owns the value of the species? And he realizes it's the judge. And it says, of this is the judge is the line. So I think that there's like the symbolic resonances are fairly similar. I mean, throughout the entire book, you have the judge kind of making this argument to the kid where he's trying to get the kid to oppose him and to stake a claim counter to his claim. And the judge's claim is that the only thing of value is war and dominance. And he just fights anyone. And I think that like a lot of the arguments that Blood Meridian is making is kind of, this is at base some of the assumptions that drive Manifest Destiny. So I actually think there's a lot of symbolic resonances between the two. And the screenplay, again, of The Counsellor is actually really interesting. The film really misses the mark. It's an interesting film, but it's not well done, I would say. But
one of the things I did notice from an economics perspective is in Blood Meridian, you're seeing the impact of the Spanish coming early to the territory, devastating encomienda systems, and then basically leaving. And that's how I viewed that whole era, was before Mexico was rising in its nationalism. There was this big void of power. Of course, the road is post-apocalyptic. Is that a consistent theme from McCarthy? This unregulated malaise of what can go terribly wrong?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, I mean, one of the things that McCarthy's kind of interested in is this idea that okay, so I'm trying to think how to describe it. There's a bit of a conflation that he makes. So in a system where you have a sort of power vacuum, you know, complete lack of regulation, but he's going to make this argument like, you know, in any completely anarchic system, then it's basically a system that's governed by the most powerful, right? So those who exert the most power have the most power. And this is the argument that Judge Holden makes, which Judge Holden is kind of making this argument that it doesn't matter what, you know, like the rule of law is only skin deep at any given point. At base, human nature is violent. People are animals. And so the only law that truly governs the market is war. Whoever can come out on top, whoever can exert the most power. You see arguments that follow along with that in the road, but the conflation happens. McCarthy is kind of interested in sort of intentionally conflating the sort of catastrophic power vacuum, lack of any sort of regulatory force, with regulatory forces. So a lot of his early stuff takes place in Appalachia. McCarthy's dad was a lawyer who worked for the Tennessee Valley Authority. And he's really interested in those early books and looking at the federal government sweeping into these really rural Appalachian areas and just blowing them to shreds. So the federal government comes in to improve the area, but then wipes out this completely rural way of life almost completely and has this utterly devastating effect. And so McCarthy is kind of interested in looking at systems, but he actually kind of conflates federal regulation and absolute deregulation in really interesting ways. So
and
I'm not sure if that answers your question or makes it like weirder.
It does, and thus my setup for The Economist. Isn't that also what the public choice lens would say? Would those with the most power?
Yeah.
Win?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that McCarthy's kind of the closest you can kind of get to seeing McCarthy's economic arguments are really interesting, I think, because he's kind of an iconoclast. He doesn't, I'm not sure that I know exactly what he would support, but kind of the only systems that you see that he has any sort of positive regard for are sort of small, local, sustainability-oriented barter economies. There isn't really a form of capitalist exchange that doesn't come in for some pretty heavy-handed critique in any of his books. So I'm not sure to what extent he would take that argument, but that's in terms of reading the imagery in his books, that's kind of what you end up with.
If you don't mind, I'll ask a question too. Just following up on what Taylor was saying, I think, you know, what you're highlighting is kind of that it's just a matter of who is in charge, right? So independent of what system you're operating in, those in power will abuse their power essentially. Like in markets, it will be, you know, capitalists. In political systems, it will be the political elites.
Mm-hmm.
So that's exactly the public choice lens, I think, is what, you know, what Taylor's referencing. And so I'm really excited. I have never read anything by Cormac McCarthy, but I'm going to try, although can't say that I have all that much time, but.
Yeah, well, I will say, if like a film is easier, he has this novel, No Country for Old Men. That novel is absolutely brilliant. I love it. It was made into a film by the Coen brothers. The Coen brothers get McCarthy. And they did a brilliant job. 100% recommend the film No Country for Old Men. So, and it's really, really similar to The Counsellor in terms of some of his arguments. But yeah, I think like that's kind of what I thought was really interesting in The Counsellor, and also in No Country for Old Men, is he does this really interesting, I mean, I think it's a lot clearer in The Counsellor, frankly, than in No Country. But he is really interested in sort of conflating licit and illicit markets and basically saying it just comes down to power.
I have a follow-up question too. So you're saying that the system that he does endorse is more like a local barter economy sort of thing. And the critique, you know, that's kind of like, I guess, a system of, I mean, communitarianism or something like that, you might call it, right? And the critique of those sorts of systems is that they're oppressive in some other way, like religious groups will come to dominate, and that can be negative as well. Does he appeal to anything like that in any of his stories?
So I wish that he actually spent more time. He has very, very few sort of positive images. His books are very dark. I love that, but it's, I guess, a taste thing. he's better at the critique mode, then here's what we should work towards. So the only positive depictions that you have, McCarthy was raised Catholic. He has a lot of skepticism, I think, about larger systems, and the Catholic Church as a whole comes in for some critique as well. But in these positive depictions, you have he uses a lot of really Christian imagery. And I think that he is not necessarily, these images are not necessarily complex. They don't really address some of the challenges that we see in systems like this. I think that, let's see. I don't want to say like it's kind of an easy thing but it's like he'll have certain small communities that, you know, like a character will, you know, experience all of this privation and awfulness and violence, and then sort of stumble into a small community. And that small community is like healthy and happy, and the people are actually kind to each other and they value each other and that sort of thing. And it's usually described as like, you know, there's some character in the community who talks about God. And so it kind of gets framed as like, you know, some sort of sacred system. And he doesn't unpack that a whole lot. So that's not necessarily a very good answer, but I also think it's not something that McCarthy explores very complexly.
Yeah, so I haven't read anything by Cormac McCarthy yet either. So this is really interesting, kind of an interesting topic. And you spoke a little bit about McCloskey. So does he go and kind of argue directly McCloskey's arguments, or was that you kind of bringing that in to kind of add that perspective? Because McCloskey, I have read some McCloskey, and as far as kind of the virtues of, she highlights kind of the virtues of the market economy, which are a lot in her perspective. So could you kind of expand a little bit on that, kind of the back and forth between the two, or if it's just kind of looking at a small argument from McCloskey and then kind of build?
That's a really good question. I actually, so McCarthy doesn't directly address McCloskey at all. In my larger project, I bring in McCloskey largely because of her treatment of private property ownership. In sort of the larger scheme of McCarthy's works, he spends a lot more time critiquing private property ownership. He is not interested in property ownership. He kind of doesn't ever perceive that as valorous. And that's, you know, McCloskey kind of frames that as sort of the bedrock element of capitalism. And so I'm suggesting that McCarthy is kind of anti-capitalist, fundamentally anti-capitalist, which is weird because he gets read as a sort of conservative author a lot. And in some ways, I think he really is, but I also think he's, again, in ways that I don't think are necessarily deeply complex. So it's hard, like, he has these kind of like big metaphors for how he discusses things or the images that he uses. So I'm not sure, like, in terms of personal belief where he's at, but you get these images that I think are pretty deeply anti-capitalist in really interesting ways. So in terms of answering your question, I'm not answering it by saying, like, I think the larger resonances actually have to do with property ownership, which I don't talk about in this particular paper. In the Counsellor, I think it really kind of comes down to choice, because the Counsellor is really interested in these internal versus external value systems. So Malkina kind of ultimately says, like, basically the right to say no is what she gave up in order to become wealthy and powerful. And you have the Counsellor who kind of accidentally, how accidental is it to decide to do a drug deal so you can afford a big diamond? I don't know. He seems as though he just kind of stumbled into this, but theoretically a lot more choice went into it than that. But you kind of have him like sort of already embarked on this path that he has no idea how it's going to end up. And so I think that the element of choice is one of those things that kind of comes under critique here in the Counsellor. And that's kind of why I teased out that particular resonance with McCloskey. But in the larger scheme of things, I think the deeper resonances are around property ownership.
And when it comes to choice, like, so I'm having a hard time figuring out, and I know you're kind of just describing the narrative of Cormac McCarthy, but you're saying that in a market economy, like this like late capitalism state, we're our choices, we actually don't have choice. We have an illusion of choice. Now, how would that look like in another system, right? So, I mean, we can critique it, but it's relative to what? I'm not sure that that choice argument would disappear in, say, a small, localized, communitarian type situation. We would still, I think that we still have choices no matter what. We have different costs imposed that influence our choices, but I'm not sure that I follow the illusion of choice. I mean, I get it that they were just kind of thrown into, they had to do this drug deal because of previous choices, but I don't know if I follow the illusion of choice in this system relative to another system. If you could kind of expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so again, I think this is one of the things that I would also probably differ from McCarthy on, but in terms of the argument that I think the Counsellor is making, I think what we get in the Counsellor is this idea that the illusion of choice comes from, the Counsellor is sort of already embroiled in this drug deal when the film starts, but when you get that first scene where he's working as a counselor, he kind of explains to the kid that he's working with that the kid was arrested for speeding, but then his bail money got confiscated, so he's not able to bail out his mom. So now he and his mom are both in jail without any. And so you kind of get this argument there that the Counsellor in his legal work was already complicit in a pretty messed up system that was sort of churning out this persistent underclass anyway. It's profiting off of the bodies of people. Without incarceration, it wouldn't function, right? So the argument of the film is that licit or illicit, this is a self-perpetuating cycle. And so I think that the illusion of choice for McCarthy is not so much saying that there's some sort of Arcadian system where you can live, in nature and have perfect choice, so much as recognizing the ways in which capitalism does not, it's not the system that gives us choice where other systems wouldn't. It is simply that within this particular system, there isn't a way out of complicity in the system. You're already in it, licit or illicit. And so I think that's what he's trying to talk about in the Counsellor. I don't necessarily know that he's setting up some other alternative, like what we should do is this other thing. Again, I think that for McCarthy, choice is problematic as a concept anyway. A lot of his works are interested in questions about determinism, and he's a bit agnostic about that. So I think that he perceives sort of the question of freedom of choice to be a little bit of maybe the wrong way to think about things, and a better way to think about things to be looking at cost relative, like the human cost and sort of the moral cost of something relative, to the good, if that makes sense.
Any other questions out there in the Zoom ether? All right. Cool. Well, that was fantastic. Really, really interesting. We're looking forward to, I hope this was helpful to you. And
It was so helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. And we're looking forward to reading this paper when it's completed. So yeah, and thank you all for tuning in. We'll have this video up on YouTube shortly. So thanks so much again. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much. You have a great rest of your day too.